the weekly show with David J. Maloney.
This week, David chats with guitarist Matteo Mancuso.
And now, here's your host, David J. Maloney.
Welcome, everyone, to the weekly show. I'm your host, David G. Maloney. On tonight's show, we've got a really special guest. He's been lauded by Steve Vai, Joe Bonamassa, and Al Di Meola as possibly the next great guitar virtuoso. His debut album, The Journey, has recently announced his arrival on the international stage, and he arrives in the U.S. on May 20th to start a brand new North American tour, which will span from coast to coast. Here to chat about his life, career, and brand new tour is none other than guitarist Matteo Mancuso. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Our featured guest tonight is an incredible musician who's been lauded by some of the greatest guitarists in the business as potentially the best, newest guitarist in the world. His debut album, The Journey, has announced him on the international stage, and he arrives in North America later this month for a coast-to-coast tour. Here to chat about his life, career, and brand new tour is none other than Matteo Mancuso. Matteo, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Too kind.
So before we talk about music, I'd like to talk a little bit about your background. I'm an Italian who's never been to Sicily, but all the Sicilians I've ever known over the years are very proud of their heritage and unique culture of the island. You grew up, I guess, just outside of Palermo, as I recall. What are some of your favorite things about growing up in Sicily?
Well, growing up in Sicily, first of all, it's a beautiful place. So I began to be affectionate to a lot of sea places in Sicily because there are tons of them. Palermo is a very beautiful city, and I consider myself extremely lucky because when I studied there, then I did the conservatory in Palermo, I did the high school, the musical high school in Palermo, and I really never had a problem. All the teachers were great. The musical environment is amazing, I think. There are not tons of musicians because Palermo is not a really big city. So you cannot compare Palermo to, I don't know, LA or New York, of course. But it's a nice place. And of course, yes, it's pros and cons, like every city in the world. But I consider myself very lucky because I was born in a very musical environment. And one of the advantages I had from the start was that I grew up in a very musical family. Like my father is also a guitar player. I have one older sister and one older brother. I'm the youngest in the family. And my older brother plays classical guitar. And my sister, she writes songs all the time. She writes like, I don't know, 30 songs every month. She's way more prolific than me. But yeah, I grew up in a very good musical environment, let's say. And I realized that after a while, because back when I was a little kid, I thought that every family was interested in music in some way. And then when I got to middle school, everyone was talking about football, like Inter Milan, Juventus, and I didn't even know what Juventus was. Like, I wasn't, I never was a football guy, let's say. And a lot of people in Italy, you know it better than me, are way more interested in football than music, let's say. And that was my first shock, let's say, when I got to the middle school, because I just thought it was a normal family, you know. Then I realized it was not that common to have all this music available from the start. That's why I consider myself very lucky because of that. I had a very good musical diet from the start. And my father still has a lot of vinyls and CDs. Sometimes we just listen music on the car or on the radio, you know. And it was a big part of my musical development.
And yeah, you'd mentioned your dad was a well-known classical guitarist himself. Do you have a favorite memory of him and his guitar playing growing up?
Well, he was not only a classical player, it was more, let's say, a session player, especially in Italy, and a producer as well. He studied classical guitar when he was younger, but back when he was young like me, or even younger than me now, at the conservatory, there was not classical guitar. So he had to choose flute, if I remember correctly. And then he studied classical guitar on his own, let's say. And he's a special player. I consider him still one of the best players I know. And I don't say this because it's my father. I mean, I listen to him every day, and every day he has something new to show me, and it's almost magical, you know. And so I think he was more active during the 80s and the 90s, and then on the first 2000s, he stayed more at home, of course, to stay with the kids, stay with me and my family. Kind of was my first listening guide, let's say. I began to know all the jazz guys thanks to him, for example. Back when I started, I was really into rock and roll, like AC/DC, Led Zeppelin, and Deep Purple, these kind of guys. But when I was around 14, it came to me and it stayed like, we need to go back in time and listen to some of the players that came before. So thanks to him, I have like good knowledge of a lot of jazz players and even non-jazz, but a lot of musicians in general that I began to know thanks to my father, let's say. So it was a huge help, especially at the start.
Now, did you gravitate to the guitar immediately, or did other instruments or perhaps hobbies ever try to pull you in, or were you locked in on the guitar from the very beginning?
Well, I was curious about music in general, but I just thought the guitar was the sexiest instrument, let's say. It was the coolest one. And also because I always saw my father playing at home. So, I mean, I was listening to guitar all the time, even before I started playing. So I just thought it was cool to play, especially electric guitar. Like, I wasn't really into classical back when I started. In fact, many people confuse this, but I actually started with the electric guitar rather than classical. And then I started studying classical guitar back when I was 14 years old in high school, but I wasn't really into it. I was a really bad student for classical guitar. And that's why I still consider myself primarily an electric player, because I really like to play with the rhythm section. I really like to play with a band. And you can do this better with the electric guitar. And simply because classical guitar is not an orchestral instrument. So you pretty much play alone most of the time, just with your score. And of course, it's beautiful. There are a lot of beautiful solo pieces for classical guitar, but I was missing the interaction between other musicians. So that's why I decided to stick with the electric more. And I still play classical guitar a lot, but it's not really the thing I prefer. Like if I play too much classical, I start to miss the sound of the electric guitar, let's say. So that's why I tend to play more electric.
Being from Sicily, and I may be a little ignorant on this, I'm curious though, is there any specific sound or type of music unique to Sicily which may have influenced a direction that you went in, or does it not have its own separate musical culture? You know, like there's certain cities, like if you're from Seattle in the States, you may have a certain sound. If you're from Boston, you may have a certain sound. In other words, based on the cultural music of that particular city or area, it may have influence. Is there any, does Sicily have any specific type of musical influence in and of itself? Or or is it just you developing your own style, your own way through your family upbringing and whatnot?
Well, I have to be honest, it was mostly American music. Like, and not because I'm not a big fan of Italian music, of course, but I tend to grow up with a lot of internet. Like my cultural and let's say also technical development was sped up thanks to YouTube. And I'm completely honest on this. I was searching for a lot of different players. I was searching for different music, and that was only thanks to internet. I will never be able to play like the way I play if I was only, let's say, influenced by local musicians. And not necessarily because the local musicians are not good in Sicily, but because there are few of them. Like there's less number of it. And I'm sure that Sicily and Italy, in a way, influenced me in the way I play. But I'm not able to pick the the influence. I'm sure it has an influence. Like, because I'm Italian, I'm Sicilian, I love the place. I I love my home, and it sure has some, let's say, musical influence on me. But if I have to say some names, for example, 90% of the names I would say as an influence are American people and
Makes sense.
Europeans in general.
Yeah, it makes sense. As you got older, I presume your father saw you progressing in your guitar craft. What is the first memory you have of maybe where your dad says, or finally lets on that your skills might be special?
To be honest, I immediately realized that when I was starting, both because I was having friends that they started guitar with me, like I was having, and still I have a lot of friends that have my same passion. And I realized that there were some things that were easier for me and harder for them. Like, I was learning things maybe in 2 hours, and they were learning the same thing in 1 week. So I asked myself, okay, this thing feels easy. So I want to concentrate on that, not necessarily because it feels easy, but also because I enjoy it, first of all. And then I started, like, before entering the YouTube era, let's say, like before discovering all the things that internet has to provide, I was comparing myself with my friends. So I thought, oh, I'm extremely good because they are not able to do that. And I am, so I'm special. And then you go on YouTube and you search for like Chinese guitar player, and they humble you down very immediately. So I immediately realized that I was not the only one that has that kind of predisposition with music and guitar in general. So I started to study more thanks to internet, actually. Like, I was realizing, okay, the level in the world, the guitar level and physical level is this one right now. There are a lot of guitar players that are incredibly good. And in order to get on that level, you really need to have both talent and study. If you have only one of these, it's not gonna work. If you have only talent and you don't put the hours and the study on it, it's not gonna work.
Let's talk about your playing style and more specifically how you use your right hand. This comes up in a lot of interviews for you, of course, because it's obviously something more unique to you. How did that develop for you?
Well, it's a funny story because I developed this technique from the start. I started playing when I was 10 years old, and my father was always playing classical guitar at home. And I just thought that every guitar was meant to be played with fingers. I didn't know that you should use a pick for the electric and fingers with classical. So I just started with this bass-like technique just because it was comfortable to me. And then, of course, I discovered about the pick, but I was too lazy to restart again. So I just kept playing with fingers, and I began to be used to it. And that was, of course, thanks to also classical guitar. It helped me a lot to achieve the technique I have now. And of course, I borrowed a lot of aspects of my technique from the classical world. And I should say, a lot of people say that I invented this technique, but it's not really true. I didn't really invent this kind of style. It's just rare to see finger style with electric guitar, but I'm not the only one that does it. I mean, it's a mix of bass technique and some classical elements, of course. In order to achieve the technique I have now, I really had to study a lot, especially in the first years.
Now, did your father or any other teacher try to get you to change that or adjust that, or did they realize that it was just your thing and let you just run with it?
I don't really remember somebody that corrected me, so I think they just let the thing going on. But in there are for sure some things that I figure out over the years to, let's say, perfect my technique. Because I was always playing with fingers, but my fingerstyle technique is not the same when I was starting, of course. There are some elements that I perfected all over the years. And that was also because I really had the chance to have very good teachers. Like my father was the first one, of course. Then I had a classical guitar teacher that's called Damiano Busento, and he was my high school classical teacher. Yeah, and he was a very patient guy. Because as I said before, I wasn't really into classical guitar back then, but he was patient enough to let me get into it slowly. And then I had Paolo Sorge as my jazz guitar teacher at the conservatory. But every one of them gave me a lot of useful stuff to grow up. And I think I got very lucky because if you have the wrong teacher, sometimes can be damaging even your passion, you know. There are some people that if they encounter the wrong teacher, they just give up sometimes. So I consider myself extremely lucky because I got the chance, especially in the classical world, because I was really lazy guy. I didn't want to read. And the thing I was doing, especially the first years of classical guitar, is that I was watching the video on YouTube and I was figuring out everything by ear. And I was not using the score because I didn't want to read. And that was because I was much faster with the ears rather than reading on the score page. But then I began to read a little bit. I don't consider myself a good sight reader even now, but thanks to Damiano Busendo, I now at least know where the notes are, let's say.
That's funny. So you mentioned American influences in music. Who were the guitarists whom you were looking up to as you were listening and learning?
Well, I should say the first big influence was not American, actually. Jimi Hendrix was the first big influence. And sorry. I should say AC/DC was the first big influence, and they're Australian. And it was the first band I really got into it. Then, of course, Hendrix, a lot of tunes from Deep Purple, Led Zeppelin, of course, Rolling Stones. And so the first tunes I learned were pretty much from these bands. So I started as a rock and roll guy. And then, of course, I switched to a lot of different things. I began to be interested in jazz fusion stuff, like Mahavishnu Orchestra, Weather Report, a lot of things from Chick Corea, for example, and also a lot of guitarists from the 80s, like Paul Gilbert, Ingrid Malmsteen, for example, for a long time, Steve Vai. Before all of this was Eddie Van Halen was, let's say, my first introduction to spread play.
Yeah, I think everybody remembers where they were the first time they heard Eruption.
Yeah, it was life-changing event.
Yes. Is there a band you currently listen to which people would be surprised to learn your interest in?
Well, not necessarily surprised. I'm a big fan of Toto, for example, because Steve Lukather is one of my favorite players for sure. But it's mostly guitar-oriented music. Maybe a little bit surprising would be the Beach Boys, for example. One of my favorite albums is Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys. Simply because it was one of the albums my father had in the car. And back when we were traveling a lot by car, he was always putting on this album. And I know all the tunes.
The harmonies on that album, their ability to harmonize on that album is incredible. I think people waver back and forth debating whether Sgt. Pepper's or Pet Sounds is the best. There's this whole argument as to which one is the best one ever made, arguably. So,
well, harmonically speaking, Pet Sounds is a little bit more advanced. It's almost like classical music in some ways. If you analyze God Only Knows, for example, it's a masterpiece of harmony and melody. And even there's, I don't remember the name, but there's an instrumental tune on that album. It's beautiful. And it's an orchestral piece. There are no words or lyrics to it. And it's amazing how they came up with this stuff back on those days. It sounds like an album made almost like 30 or 40 years later.
So you've been writing, recording, playing music for years, having stuff on YouTube for years. Do you sense certain meanings in certain sounds? And if so, what does that kind of mean to your music? I mean, to be able to have the power to like change people's moods, feelings, make them happy or sad or any number of things. I mean, what does that ability kind of, I guess, mean to you?
Well, it means a lot, of course. You have this power that you need to be able to incorporate into your own playing. And let's say it doesn't always happen to give emotion to people. If you're not emotion yourself with guitar, so you need to be able to first of all emotion yourself just with playing with yourself first, I think, in order to give the best to your audience, I think. And that's the same thing that said Santana, I think, in an interview. You need to give choose to yourself first in order to be able to play convincingly with other people, you know, in order to give the same emotion you are sensing, you need to be able to sense and view first. And sometimes it can happen if you study a lot with your instrument to lose focus on this. Like you need to be able to, first of all, like what you are playing in order to give this kind of emotions. And sometimes it doesn't happen. There are some days I have to be honest, there are some days that I feel disconnected to the instrument. And there are some other days where I really give choice to myself every time I play. I still cannot command that. There are some days that I'm able to do it. There are some other days that it just doesn't happen.
It's just
so, yeah, it's just not there. And you cannot have a switch on this area, you know? You can work on the technique. I mean, you can work on everything. If you put the hours, you can get there, of course. But this kind of emotional side of things, it's more connected to the way you feel in that moment. And you cannot command this. Well, if you feel happy or you feel like really into the song, it just happens. You know, there are some gigs where I really feel very connected to the music. Some gigs when I'm not there. You know, I'm just playing.
just kind of going through the motions.
Yeah. So I still have to figure out a way to be more, let's say, have more control with this.
That's our show for tonight. Thank you so much for watching, and a special thanks to Matteo Mancuso for joining us. Matteo will be back again next week to finish up our interview, so please tune back in. Stay safe, everyone.